2 or 3 minutes for people to meet us here in this virtual space, a few minutes on the top of the hour. For us in South Africa, where we are, it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I think it's the same in Geneva in Central European time. But wherever you are, give us a minute or two and we will be starting very, very soon. Welcome in the meantime. So good afternoon to all our participants. You are most welcome to this very, very illustrious occasion, the second annual Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture, which forms part of the Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot Court Competition. And this Moot Court Competition is organized by the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria and the Faculty of Law, together with the Washington College of Law and specifically the Institute for International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights and the Academy at the American University. We also have been joined this year by the Commonwealth Secretariat as an organizing partner, and we do the Moot, and we have been doing the Moot in collaboration with the Human Rights Council branch of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And this is the 13th edition of the Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot Court Competition. In fact, earlier today, the quarterfinals of this Moot Court competition took place. But we started not last year, but 2 years ago, we started to institutionalize as part of this Moot Court competition, the Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. The first lecture was presented by retired Justice of the South African Constitutional Court, human rights activist of note, Albie Sachs. And that was a wonderful occasion in Geneva. Regrettably, we are not able to be together in Geneva today, but I think as a consequence, perhaps we include people who would not have been able to be with us in Geneva. So there's always a silver lining. We then present this Nelson Mandela lecture not only together with these partners that are part of the Moot, but also together specifically with the African group of ambassadors in Geneva, where the South African permanent mission in Geneva also played a very particular role. So thank you to all our partners, and thank you to everyone who is now also with us in this virtual space. Thank you to our speakers, our lecturers for today's lecture. We thought it
I think it's a bit frozen.
My apologies. I fell off for a second there. I hope I'm back. Yes. And, you know, I suppose this is the sign of our times. My apologies. Our network is a bit unstable, as many other things are unfortunately a bit unstable here in the southern part of the African continent. We are here to remember 2001, when the Durban Conference, the World Conference on Racism, Xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance took place, and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action was adopted. 20 years, we take stock, we think what the priorities are for the future, and we will be led in this reflection and in this pondering priorities by our wonderful panel. But before we get to that, I ask Ambassador Muhammadou, who is the Gambian permanent representative to the United Nations office at Geneva, and also currently the chair of the African group of ambassadors in Geneva, to do the official word of welcome. May I just say that Ambassador Carr is someone who has many years of experience in higher education, in science, technology, in the corporate world, I was fortunate enough to have my paths cross with his when he was the Vice Chancellor of the University of the Gambia. I know that he was also and is involved with the American University in Nigeria. We thank you very much, Ambassador, for the role you've played together with others in bringing us here today. And we look forward to your words of welcome on behalf of the African Group of Ambassadors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague and brother, distinguished panelists, excellencies, participants. On behalf of the Africa Group of Ambassadors in Geneva and the Center for Human Rights of the University of Pretoria, South Africa, together with its partners, the Academy of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you today to the second annual Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. I wish to most sincerely convey our appreciation to our dearest colleague and brother here in Geneva for all his tireless efforts, His Excellency, my brother, Ambassador Nkolis Nkosi, the South Africa Permanent Rep at the United Nations offices in Geneva. We are delighted to have you with us to participate and share in the side event on the fringes of the 47th Human Rights Council session. I thank you all for making time to participate. Distinguished panelists, excellencies, and participants, in these disruptive days of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of you have had to adjust to a barrage of online activities, albeit sometimes at unsociable hours. This serves as a reminder just how important our work on improving human rights is and the need for us all to be active and vigilant in the promotion of human rights for all, leaving no one behind. As we all are aware, the DDPA is the outcome document of the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Established as the standard of non-discrimination in international law, the DPPA has served as the foremost mechanism to galvanize the international community to speak with one voice in emphasizing that racism and racial intolerance is unacceptable. Distinguished panelists, excellencies, and participants, thanks to the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Council has evolved as a key jigsaw piece in the vast repertoire of the United Nations system for peaceful global coexistence. We must not underestimate the work and value that the DDPA has brought in shaping today's discourse on racism and racial intolerance in many spheres. The world must know, and we must continue to be relentless in our collective efforts, ensuring we uproot racism and all its forms from everywhere, and that all Africans everywhere deserve human and social dignity. I must say, continuing ignorance is central to the perpetuation of racism. No one is born a racist. We must be relentless in our efforts to educate and enlighten always, without which values will continue to be eroded and chaos increasingly looms in our societies, and those that perpetuate racism will continue to cause societal instability and our collective insecurity and risks, as have been seen across the world with recent events. We urgently need to return and respect our shared humanity, our unique and rich African cultural values and heritage that has always, always respected and protected human rights of individuals and communities and love for humanity. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I reflect on this year's lecture for the 20th anniversary of the DDPA, the importance and centrality of responsible leadership in all strata in our countries and communities, and our individual and collective resolve to go beyond the usual rhetoric and confrontations are required in abundance measure to implement actions for an impactful and result-oriented DDPA. Excellencies, distinguished panelists and participants, my reflections and thoughts are best encapsulated in a statement by our great and rare gem and Africa's iconic statesman, late President Nelson Mandela, who this second annual theme is named after. And I quote, he said, this was in 1994 in Cape Town, in a speech, he said, our single most important challenge is therefore to help establish a social order in which the freedom of the individual will truly mean the freedom of the individual. We must construct that people-centered society of freedom in such a manner that it guarantees the political liberties and the human rights of all our citizens. And this is critical in our efforts within the DDPA. It is against this backdrop that the panel of eminent, knowledgeable, and distinguished personalities before us have been identified to present to us today. They will remind us how it all started, how far we have come, but more importantly, help us chart the way forward in our quest for a fairer and equitable world, free from racism and racial intolerance. It is indeed, ladies and gentlemen, my greatest honor on behalf of my colleagues, our excellencies at Geneva, the Africa Group of Ambassadors and co-sponsors, to invite you to the start of this event. And we thank you and we look forward to the panel's deliberations. Thank you, Your Excellencies.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Ambassador Ka. We really appreciate your role and your words of welcome and contextualizing our event. So I think most of our participants would know that there are 4 panelists. I will introduce each of them and they will have approximately 20 minutes to share with us their perspective. Thereafter, there will be an opportunity for questions, answers, and your comments are most welcome in the question and answer chat box. So please, as the presenters make their contributions, you are welcome to raise your questions. We will take those as we conclude the 4 introductory panelists' remarks. The first panelist this afternoon is Dr. Navi Pillay. I think she needs no introduction. That's what moderators usually say, and then they proceed to make a very long and extensive introduction. I will not fall into that trap, but I need to just mention a few facts, Navi, if you'll allow me. First of all, I think she has been the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. That is, I think, what we all know from 2008 to 2014. And most pertinently to our topic of the day is the fact that during 2009, during her termship, we had the Durban Review Conference. So I think Dr. Pillay Navi will speak to the historical context, include also the reflections on the Durban Review Conference. We may know that she also served as a judge of the International Criminal Court and as president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, among many, many other accolades. We welcome you, Dr. Pillay. We appreciate your wonderful historical perspective. And we also know that perhaps in your remarks, you will ponder a little bit about how Nelson Mandela could be remembered within the context of the topic we speak to today. Thank you so much. We welcome you and listen to you gladly, Dr. Pillay.
Thank you very much, Frans, and I'm very pleased to be part of this distinguished panel and to share observations on the 20th anniversary of the Durban Conference. Actually, mine are not just observations, it's more a real life experience. I grew up under apartheid, born in Durban, South Africa, where the conference was held. And of course, I experienced all the suffering and abuse of racism. Secondly, having had the privilege of serving under President Mandela in a democratic South Africa, and as well as a Black lawyer fighting against racist laws for justice before I became the first Black woman to act as a judge here. Thirdly, as Frans mentioned, I was the UN High Commissioner and Secretary General of the UN Review Conference on Racism in 2009. I want to firstly congratulate the Human Rights Center at the University of Pretoria for holding the annual Nelson Mandela Lecture and Moot Court in honor of the world icon who continues to be our inspiration. In particular, credit for keeping Mandela's principles alive in the form of this annual lecture goes to the late Professor Christoph Heinz, who sadly passed away a few months ago, and to Professor Frans Viljoen. Thank you for what you're doing. Now, as has been mentioned, the UN World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances was held between August 31st and September 8th, 2001 in Durban. And insiders at the UN simply referred to the conference and the documents as Durban. So what emerged, obviously, is the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The preamble to DDPA records, and I want to quote that, the inspiration from the heroic struggle of the people of South Africa against the institutionalized system of apartheid, as well as for equality and justice under democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. The important contribution of the international community and the pivotal role of the people and governments of Africa, and the important role of civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations in the struggle against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and so on. And this conference noted with appreciation the vision statement that was read at the conference under the patronage of Nelson Mandela, the first president of democratic South Africa. The declaration comprises some 122 paragraphs and represents the commitments made by all states at a global dialogue to end racism. It addresses both past manifestations as well as contemporary forms of racial discrimination. The program of action, comprising 218 paragraphs, is a roadmap on how the international community will implement these commitments, such as the provision of effective remedies, recourse, redress, and compensation at national, regional, and international levels, and then awareness and education, and to spread the truth of history. And all of us in Africa know how our history has been distorted and contributed to racism. I picked out several important issues that the states agreed at this conference. One, that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should have always been so. Secondly, that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, especially in the negation of the essence of the victims. You know, I was once invited as a High Commissioner for Human Rights to address a parliamentary group in Britain on the transatlantic slave trade and its effect on human rights. And I was very surprised to see that up till today, the authoritative jurisprudence is that set out by the House of Lords, the highest court in England, which ruled against abolition by stating that the slave trade was a legitimate trade in commodity. And so, as I said, this infamous judgment still stands, and this is why the DDPA is so progressive in setting out that this is really enslavement of human beings. The third point the DDPA noted was that colonialism had led to racism and caused suffering, and its consequences persist to this day. Fourthly, the inalienable right of Palestinian people to self-determination and to an independent state was recognized. The right to security of all states, including Israel, was recognized. And sixthly, a victim-oriented approach was advocated, with special references made to Africans and people of African descent, and to Asians and people of Asian descent, and also inclusively included groups such as indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, minorities, and others. So the DDP, I think, was deemed a success as an historic outcome, a forward-looking platform, a beginning, not an end. Victims of racism, including myself, welcome this outcome document with deep emotion, having gone through centuries of racism in South Africa. And yet, the conference itself in Durban was marked by controversy, which metastasized for years and years, spilling its poison into every subsequent UN activity relating to Durban, including the UN Review Conference of Durban in 2009, where I said I was the Secretary General. Many of us recall from the withdrawal from the Durban Conference by the US delegation headed by US Secretary of State Colin Powell over disagreement with language in one of the earlier drafts purporting to equate Zionism with racism. The words were omitted in the final draft, but the antagonism still persisted. Another occurrence that at that conference related, I was told, to sensitivity by Israel and its supporters to hurtful and insulting treatment of Israel by some Arab states and NGOs. In the immediate aftermath of the conference, the foreign minister of Israel, who had represented his country at the conference, had recorded on his website that Durban was a success story for Israel. And yet, for the next 6 years leading up to the Durban Review Conference mandated by the GA, a sustained campaign was mounted both within the UN by Israel and the US, and on the outside of the UN by pro-Israel lobby groups to discredit Durban and to block the holding of the review conference that was mandated by the GA. The matter was politicized to the detriment of the anti-racism agenda. And of course, another impediment to the implementation of the DDPA arose from the fact that the attack on the World Trade Center towers in the US occurred on 11 September 2001, just 3 days after Durban ended. And so attention was distracted away from Durban to the more immediate challenge of ensuring safety against terrorist actions. Now, I must confess, I was totally unaware of these controversies surrounding Durban prior to my interview for the position of High Commissioner for Human Rights. That was in August 2008. The UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, told me that the member states, or some of them, wanted the position filled fast in order for the review conference to proceed as scheduled. Now, I had 8 months left on my term as a judge, and I was initially adamant against resigning as the judge. I even told the Secretary General, no judge resigns. But the Secretary General convinced me of the urgency. He explained that the inclusion of the review conference as a line item in the UN budget document had led to the US year in and year out objecting to the entire budget of the UN, resulting in holdups to all programmatic work of the UN. And other heads of departments complained to me. I was so new, I was really shocked by what they were telling me. They complained to me, it is because of your human rights program that our budgets are being held up each year and only passed at midnight on 24th December. each year. So, 4 months into my term, in late December 2008, I received a call from the Deputy US Ambassador to the UN. And he told me, "We will not vote against your program on racism and will persuade Israel to do likewise if you agree to drop Durban from the declaration." And I said, "How about the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights? Should I drop the name Vienna?" So that ended the conversation. And of course, you can see this is the judge speaking. Of course, I had great hope that the Obama administration would participate in the review conference. As the first Black president of the US, there was great expectation that he would support the conference against racism. In negotiations with US representatives, I was asked to delete the word reaffirm in the draft outcome document that we were working on for the review conference. The sentence read, "The review conference reaffirms the DDPA." So I told them that it was not possible for us not to use the word reaffirm. Every UN conference carries forward the prior agreed document. So to my disappointment, President Obama declined to have the US participate in the review conference on racism. The US decision caused a ratchet effect of withdrawals by 7 Western governments. And of course, the remarks of President Ahmadinejad of Iran, who was the only head of state present at the conference, critical of Israel, added fuel to the furor as well. Now, these withdrawals by Western states appeared to me to be in support of political agendas vis-a-vis Israel, rather than opposition to the principles and action plans to end racism. Because as soon as the conference was over, some of these ambassadors whose states withdrew from the conference came to see me, and they assured me that their governments support the outcome document and will be adopting action plans to implement the recommendations. In fact, one major country came to see me with a check. They wanted to contribute to the office. So the review conference was then held between 20th and 24th April 2009 in Geneva, and it was aimed at assessing the progress made since the 2001 World Conference. It concluded with a consensus on how to achieve real changes for a new beginning with renewed and re-energized determination and purpose. And in my closing remarks as Secretary General of the conference, I lauded the commitments, the flexibility, and the concessions made by all governments and regional groups which produced this agreed document. The conference proved to be a celebration of tolerance and dignity for all, and it produced a meaningful, enshrining, common aspiration to defy racism in all its manifestations and work to stamp it out wherever it may occur. Now, addressing the few governments who had chosen to stay away from the conference, I said, I quote, "They should now evaluate the outcome document on its own merit and substance and rejoin international efforts to combat racism as mapped out by the outcome document. The focus," I said, "now must be on implementation." 20 years after the adoption of the DDPA, and the entire activity of the UN is currently recorded in the 31st December 2020 resolution passed by the UNGA, where they trace all the activities, and there are mountains and mountains of activities, UN activities, to keep these issues alive and to bring about the change we want. And this resolution also points to the current situation. It's the resolution makes a global call for concrete action for the elimination of racism. And it stressed that the DDPA remains a solid basis and the only instructive outcome of the World Conference, which prescribes comprehensive measures for combating all the scourges of racism and provides adequate remedies for victims. And the member states of the GA noted with concern the lack of effective implementation of the DDPA. So the Durban document, the DDPA, is always referred to in terms of three comments. One, that it is the most comprehensive document on combating racism. Two, that it is not being implemented effectively. And third is the recognition that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances have a deep negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights and therefore require a united, comprehensive response from the international community. Now, with regard to what's the current situation in the world relative to racism, the member states of the GA expressed the alarm at the global rise in hate speech and violence, underlying the need to promote tolerance, inclusion, respect for diversity. And they also raised the alarm at the rise of racist extremist movements based on ideologies that seek to promote nationalist, right-wing agendas and racial superiority that fuel racism, racial discrimination, and so on. The GA resolution also deplores the excessive use of force and human rights violations by law enforcement officers against Africans and people of African descent. It further underscored the intensity, magnitude, and organized nature of slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade and the associated historic injustices, as well as the untold suffering caused by colonialism and apartheid. And that Africans and people of African descent, Asians and people of Asian descent, indigenous people, all continue to be victims. Importantly, member states acknowledge that the effects are ongoing and must be remedied. So it's not past history. I can't tell you how many times, as High Commissioner, I heard the scorn of certain countries who had practiced slavery and colonialism in the past, telling me that that's just an excuse being raised by Africa, particularly, and clearly indicating that they have no heart to provide any kind of compensation. In fact, many of you know that there was great resistance to a thorough discussion of slavery, colonialism, and so on. And this is why I decided to focus on this. And you will see the recent report provided by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, which was delivered, I think, on 3 days ago, 9th of July. It makes a significant finding at paragraph 8 of the report that indicates that racism and racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent are often rooted in policies and practices grounded in the debasement of the status of individuals in society. Their impact, she writes, is particularly apparent in states with a legacy or links to enslavement, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and or colonialism resulting in the presence of sizable communities of people of African descent in their countries. Systemic racism often manifests itself in pervasive racial stereotypes, prejudice, and bias, and is frequently rooted in histories and legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and colonialism. So this is a powerful reminder that this is not long past history that should be forgotten. The truth must be told. Now, the GA in Section 7 actually sets out the theme that they expect for the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of Durban, which is reparation, racial justice, and equality for people of African descent. They hope for a political declaration aimed at mobilizing political will at the national, regional, and international levels for the full and effective implementation of DDPA. And the resolution emphasizes the critical importance of public support for the DDPA. It stresses the importance of participation by civil society. Now, this I readily endorse, this call for greater democratic space for civil society and for states to respond to the voices of victims. The transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism were grave violations of international law that obliges states to make reparations proportionate to the harms inflicted and to ensure that structures in societies that are perpetuating the injustices of the past are transformed. I was thinking about this because we have many protests on the streets. We're going through some right now. But the protests I'm referring to are the voices on the streets in South Africa and in other former colonies that demand to know why human rights to health, to education, and justice, and right to clean water are not available to all, but continue to be treated as commodities for sale only to the elite. So I feel that's another hand down from colonialism. They always intend to create the elite and put a high price on human rights. So in this report of the Office of the High Commissioner that was delivered to the Human Rights Council on 9th July, I quote, "The agenda towards transformative justice for racial justice and equality is noted, and that the objectives of a transformative agenda are to reverse cultures of denial, dismantle systemic racism, accelerate the pace of action, end impunity for human rights violations by law enforcement officials, close trust deficits in this area, ensure that the voices of people of African descent and those who stand up against racism are heard, and that their concerns are acted upon. Transformative agenda also requires us to acknowledge and confront legacies, including through accountability and redress." So then on the way forward, it is essential that states make a rigorous effort to dismantle structures that contribute to political, social, and economic inequalities, and to comprehensively address the manifestations, the root causes, and the drivers of systemic racism. States must create conditions of life that uphold dignity and human rights. And we have all this in international human rights law. We have clear frameworks for attaining substantive racial justice and equality. They place obligations on states to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination, dismantle and reform institutions, policies, and practices that may not be discriminatory in purpose, but are discriminatory in outcome and effect. So thank you very much. I will end there. Thank you, Frans.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pillay, for your insights. I think you brought your personal insider's view, and you gave us a much broader perspective, linking also, I think, racism to so-called socioeconomic rights, that there's a broad reverberance to what the issue of racial discrimination entails. And we thank you for your remarks, reminding our participants that you are welcome to add any comments into the comment section or pose your questions for a later discussion. We move to our second panelist, and it I think is interesting to note that we have an all-woman panel today, which I think is just a good thing. and wonderful to note. So our second panelist is Dr. Gay Mcdougall. Again, many things to say about her. I think she has a life dedicated to fighting against racial discrimination in many ways. She's, among other things, a professor of law at Fordham University. But in an institutional sense, she has played an important role within the United Nations, on the one hand, as the UN independent expert on minority issues from 2005 to 2011, and now recently elected to a third term on the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the CERD committee, to which she will also speak. So thank you so much, Dr. Mcdougall, for agreeing to also share your life and your professional experience with us this afternoon in the context of this discussion on the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action. You are welcome to take the floor.
Well, thank you, Dr. Viljoen. And I want to start by saying that I'm so honored and pleased to be able to share this panel with these distinguished women with whom I have worked in different points of my career. Navi Pillay, who I first met in South Africa in the 1980s, and later worked with when she was High Commissioner. Edna Roland, a fellow traveler from the days of the Durban Conference, and Mona Wishmawi, a friend and colleague through many decades of work at the UN. So I am honored to be with all of them. And I will say that, first of all, I felt very happy and honored to be at the Durban conference. I represented CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination there. And I participated in a number of the regional preparatory conferences leading up to the Durban conference, which spanned over 2 to 3 years. I conceptualized a major part of the conference, which was the Voices of Victims Forum, which was an effort to bring into the diplomatic space real people who could speak to as representatives of what racism looked like in the 21st century. So that was very important to me. And I will say that, you know, I've been involved in the UN's engagement with the struggle against racism since the 1970s, since the early 1970s. And looking back over that whole span of many decades, I would say that there are 3 high points for me in that the experience. First was the engagement of the UN in the global struggle to end apartheid. Second was the Durban Conference. And a third was, you know, what we have been through this past year in the UN's reckoning, if you will, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd. And I want to take this opportunity to give my deep gratitude personally and as a political actor, campaigner against racial discrimination, my deep gratitude to the Africa Group at the UN that took this matter in hand last year, in summer of last year, and shepherded it through to a very incredible and positive culmination yesterday in the resolution that is focused on looking at these issues again in a comprehensive way, but also looking, establishing a new mechanism that is going to take a closer look at law enforcement as an instrument of racism in the many countries where it's been a very big problem. So Ambassador Nkosi, thank you very, very much. And I hope you don't object that I will henceforth refer to the resolution as the George Floyd resolution. After hearing, the comments, the lecture really of my good friend Navi Pillay, it has led me to think, well, my goodness, I should toss the comments that I had planned because I was actually going to take you all back to Durban itself to talk about some of the high points in Durban from my point of view. And you could set that in the middle of the sweeping, description of the fight for racial equality in the UN that Dr. Pillay has just given us. There were maybe 5 or 6 sort of important points that came out of Durban, and all of them have had important implications for the work of the Committee on Racial Discrimination. Number one, I just want to go back to the point that Dr. Pillay has made in depth. The Durban Conference discussed the deep historical roots of racism, confronting issues such as the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, colonialism, and the problems faced by descendants of African peoples throughout the world. The debates were about who should bear the burden of history. In contrast, for example, let me say that the International Convention Against Racial Discrimination, actually, which was adopted in 1968, actually makes no reference to the past. It's solely forward-looking. But the Durban Declaration, which was a consensus document, so that tells you a lot, certainly did not resolve all of the issues of the past, but it moved the debate forward. Governments acknowledged and expressed profound regret to those who suffered the effects of slavery and colonialism. And for the first time, governments recognized that slavery and slave trading are crimes against humanity and, quote, should always have been considered so. Now, as an international lawyer, I've got to tell you that there's another view that they were considered so in the past. But governments did acknowledge it at Durban that slavery, colonialism were root causes of contemporary racism, and declared that the effects of slavery and colonialism continue to significantly impact the lives of descendant victims today. They also, the declaration states, and I quote, Africans and people of African descent, Asians and people of Asian descent, and indigenous peoples were victims of these acts and continue to be victims of their consequences. So governments really drew a line, affirmed that there is a connection, the political, socioeconomic, cultural practices and structures of colonialism have contributed to contemporary forms of racism. The declaration also affirms that, quote, telling the truth about history is an essential element for international reconciliation and the creation of societies based on justice, equality, and solidarity. But there was a major struggle over acknowledging that these massive crimes require reparations. That battle was won by those states who were major offenders. This was, of course, a great disappointment to most of the civil society participants in the conference. And unfortunately, I don't think we have fully gotten there yet. I think that the experience that we've been through over the past year with the George Floyd resolution and the extraordinary work that was produced out of the High Commissioner's office with her report, gone a long way in that respect. But governments, particularly those who were the greatest offenders, are still dragging their feet on that one. Secondly, the World Conference process also provided a snapshot of racism in the 21st century. The face of racial discrimination had changed significantly since the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was adopted. So apartheid had ended, and colonialism had largely been defeated. Radical changes in the global economic system was forcing massive population migrations from former colonial countries to northern industrial countries. So migrant communities were now making racial equality an issue of domestic concern for practically every nation. So in Durban, governments declared that, in fact, in this third millennium, the fight against racism had become a domestic priority for all nations. Racism exists now in practically every country of the world. Third, the World Conference also emphasized the fact that poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, and economic disparities are all closely associated with racism and racial discrimination. In fact, the World Bank confirmed it at Durban 2001 that racism and racial discrimination keep people in poverty, lead to a loss in personal and social security, and destroy the social fiber and fundamental dimensions for diversity. 4, the Durban process also encouraged the generation of new data and analysis about the situation of people of African descent around the world. And that was produced by UN agencies, special research bodies, academic institutions, working groups, and expert seminars. Hundreds of studies were produced about, for example, the particular interplay between globalization and racism, how racism and inequality may be linked to the way labor markets are structured, and matters of differential access to government institutions. So our database of knowledge on contemporary forms of racism grew exponentially as a result of the World Conference. 5, of course, governments made many pledges and commitments to take action. I think that Dr. Pillay has fully described this point. What I would say, however, is that in many situations, in many respects, those commitments are still pending implementation. 6, the success of the World Conference may best be reflected in the way it empowered racialized groups around the world, many of whom have been struggling with the invisibility of their cause. They were able at Durban to articulate their issues to the world community and to engage their governments in a manner they had not been able to do in the past. In Durban, they had opportunities for building new coalitions, sharing experiences, gaining strength and strategizing. Groups representing the Roma, for example, migrant groups and Dalits felt that the conference focused the world attention on their issues, maybe for the first time, and created allies for their cause, galvanized their grassroots movements, and produced concrete advances in their circumstances. In my view, it was the people of African descent in Latin America that empowerment was the most substantial, and the gains were concrete and dramatic. And I'm sure Dr. Roland will talk more about that. So, in conclusion, let me just say, that in my recollection, the Durban conference was not going to be easy from the beginning of the endeavor. It was the first time a global meeting of that type sought to discuss racism, not as a foreign policy matter like apartheid, but as a scourge that existed in every country and in all societies. No government really wanted to have that discussion. Just a little side anecdote, I used to joke that, and it was almost true, that every government that would come before CERD to make its report on its work to implement CERD would start by saying, oh, we don't have racism in our country. And I think that it was so much harder, almost impossible for governments to start their discussions about the conditions in their country that way after the Durban conference. What we gained at Durban was a commitment to equality expressed by a vast majority of world states. Governments reaffirmed some of humanity's most profound legal principles, like equality and non-discrimination based on race. They recommitted themselves as a global community to those principles and elaborated the meaning of those principles in a new millennium. It was a moral rearmament for a struggle against one of the world's most intractable problems, racism. Some governments and NGO groups that came to Durban left disappointed, and that was unfortunate. But I think that with the benefit of time, Durban has proved to be an important milestone in what is a very long-term struggle. And, I think that we've made a tremendous leap forward this past year through the leadership of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Africa Group at this 47th Human Rights Council. Have we won all of the battles? Absolutely not. We still have a long, long way to go about reparations. Although I am more and more convinced that reparations are an essential part of creating equality. But we've got that battle to fight. And I think that the other bottom line is economic and social rights, poverty. As I travel the world as a special rapporteur on minorities, what I saw was that when you want to find where the minorities are, where the people are who are suffering from racism, there are two places. You find them in the jails, and you find them in those communities that are the poorest of the poor. And I guess finally, we have not been able to figure out the key to political will. What Durban has said, what the review conference concluded, and even what the resolution that has been hard fought and tremendous gains out of the 47th Human Rights Council is unable to do is to figure out how to generate political will in governments to do what's right. Lots of words, how to get to implementation. That's the wall that we've not been able to climb yet. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mcdougall. A wonderful, again, linking your own personal experience of the conference, the Durban conference, to your insights from a contemporaneous perspective. We really appreciate. I jot down in my memory your eloquent phrasing of this conference as a moral rearmament to serve us in our conquest against one of the most intractable problems that our modern world faces. So thank you very much, Gay, for sharing that with us. I think you've given us much to ponder, highlighting some of the challenges that are still with us, despite the wonderful advances that we've seen through the Durban Declaration. We now come to our third panelist, who is Dr. Edna Maria Santosh Roland. And Dr. Roland is a Brazilian by nationality. She's also a psychologist by profession, but she's got varied experience that also is seeped into and has constantly dealt and struggled with the issue of racism, racial discrimination in civil society capacities, but also within civil service. She's the founder of NGOs in Brazil, among them the Collective of Black Women of the State of Sao Paulo and many others. I'm sure she will tell us a little bit more about her own involvement, but we note that she was also there in Durban in 2001 as part of a consultant to the Brazilian delegation. And she ended up playing a very important role also as the Rapporteur General for the conference. So thank you very much for agreeing to be with us today, Edna, and we sincerely look forward to your sharing your reflections and insights. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this nice and so generous presentation. It's a great honor and pleasure to participate of this second annual Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture together with Dr. Navi Pillay, our great High Commissioner for Human Rights, with Dr. Gay Mcdougall, a good friend of mine, member of CERD, the Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and Ms. Mona Hishwami, the chief of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination branch of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. In 2001, I participated of the whole process of making up the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. At the beginning, as it was told, as a representative of a civil society organization, and at the regional conference of Santiago in Chile, I started collaborating with the negotiations of the text that resulted from the conference. And following in the second and third preparatory conferences in Geneva, I was collaborating and working together with the Brazilian ambassadors. And finally, I was invited by the government of the President Fernando Henrique if I would accept to represent Brazil as the General Rapporteur of the World Conference presided by the South Africa Foreign Minister, Madame Zuma. So I had this opportunity of serving in this very important role in this conference that I consider that it has really been a milestone in the world's history of fighting racism. Now I am a member of and chairperson of the group of independent eminent experts and was appointed by the Secretary General as requested by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Our mandate is specifically to follow the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. So we have a special interest and commitment with the implementation of this milestone in the fight against racism that was finalized in the land of Nelson Mandela. The Durban Declaration Program of Action was the outcome and the result of a great coming together of people and governments from all parts of the world, and it is a very sort of as a result of a very sort of preparatory process. It resulted in a visionary document of greatest importance. In fact, the entire work of the United Nations today in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council is based on the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Many of you certainly know, there are various follow-up mechanisms of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. In our case, the components of the eminent groups are appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and there are two other mechanisms, which are the Working Group on People of African Descent and the Special Rapporteur, who are experts appointed by the Human Rights Council. The DDPA remains a profound milestone in articulating the harms of racism and racial discrimination, both historically and in the present, with an important emphasis on the structural forms of racism and racial discrimination that to this day require urgent attention. It provides a blueprint for concrete action to address racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and marks a fundamental development in human rights. This blueprint must be central to contemporary efforts to combat racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Its guidance is relevant for long-term global initiatives, such as the implementation of the United Nations ongoing international efforts to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. When we talk about positive implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, we need to recognize that it has been very uneven. In some regions, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action is very little used and very little known, while in the region from where I come from, the Latin American region, it has played a very important role for building up programs to combat racism. In the case of Brazil, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action has been a milestone in terms of the creation of programs of affirmative action. The impact of the programs of affirmative actions in the access of the public universities in Brazil has been so great that we have a completely different scenario in terms of who accesses the public universities in Brazil. And our programs, in fact, they combine a concept considering race, but also considering class. And so the combination of those two factors as to access the public universities has resulted in a situation where if not the majority, we are very close to having the majority of students in Brazil coming from the lower classes and coming from the people of African descent group. Also, besides these programs that refer to the access to education, also we have affirmative action programs to access the public service in some cities. And so this is a tendency that we may recover if in the future we have a change in our political situation that now in Brazil, as some of you may know, we are in a very hard times, we are having very difficult times in terms of our federal government. Also, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action had a significant impact in terms of the process of the recognition of the Quilombo, which are the rural communities that are dispersed in all the area, the territory of Brazil, and communities that come from the period of slavery, and where people were able to keep their lands, and they have fought very hardly to survive. And Durban was a very important tool in order to defend their rights and to have access to some benefits that were offered by the federal government. In other countries in the region, we also can refer to positive results from the Durban Declaration Program of Action. For example, in the case of Colombia, in the case of Chile and Argentina, Costa Rica. So these are countries where various programs have been developed, have been created, initially, especially with the production of data that allow us to know the difference, the existing difference between the population of African descent and other components of our national populations. So, together with the Special Rapporteur on Racism and the Working Group on People of African Descent, our group of independent, eminent experts, we have come to the conclusion that lack of public knowledge about the real content of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action constitute a major obstacle towards generating political will for its full and effective implementation. States have not done enough to mainstream this instrument within their human rights efforts and to invest the necessary resources to educate the public and its institution about the DDPA as a comprehensive guide for combating racism. The DDPA is no doubt one of the least disseminated UN programs. In many countries, its true content has been distorted. The absence of information efforts by the United Nations on the DDPA has been particularly serious. It's obvious that people cannot use an instrument that they do not know that exists. And the DPA cannot be effective if it's not used. The General Assembly of the United Nations has for several years expressed their concern about the lack of political will for the DPA implementation and for the need for the HRC to establish an outreach program with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide strengthened outreach activities needed to inform and mobilize the global public in support of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and to strengthen awareness of the contribution that they have made in the struggle against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. This is a request that has the strong support of the United Nations express mechanisms related to racism. The outreach program should be provided with sufficient resources to raise the visibility and accessibility of the DPA in collaboration with civil society organizations and communities subject to racism and xenophobia. States must make the DPA a central pillar of human rights education and implementation, and in that way demonstrate their resolve to combating all forms of racism and to realizing every individual's inherent human dignity. At its last meeting, the eminent group recommended the Human Rights Council to develop and adopt at its forthcoming sessions a comprehensive multi-year outreach program to contribute to the preparations for the 20th anniversary and beyond, including system-wide United Nations coordination and support for the Durban Declaration and Program of Action outreach. Activation of the United Nations Information Centers, wider dissemination of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action in official and non-official United Nations languages, engagement with universities and other educational entities and schools for the inclusion of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action in their curricula, promoting outreach through libraries, researching and publicizing positive examples of implementation of the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action, production of education and publicity material on the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, including youth-friendly material, engagement with news media, support for civil society networking, engagement with social media, and inclusion of proposals for seminars and strategy meetings at both the international and regional levels. I am very glad to be able to tell that the Intergovernmental Working Group on the Effective Implementation of the Durban Declaration Program of Action welcomed our proposals at their last session in October 2020 and requested the concrete proposals by the group of eminent independent experts be included in the preparation of an active outreach program for the DPA information and advocacy, and invited our group to further develop on our proposals in consultation with states, experts, and civil society organizations. So we are now in the process of sending out invitation to all relevant actors to provide input to the outreach program as requested by the Intergovernmental Working Group and in implementation of the recent General Assembly resolutions. We very much hope to have the cooperation from everybody to be able to provide the Human Rights Council with a well-organized draft to be considered by states as a major contribution to the 20th anniversary of the DDPA. Regrettably, the DDPA has become a victim of an unacceptable disinformation campaign, which has led a group of states to declare a boycott of the 20th anniversary high-level meeting of the General Assembly. To this aggressive disinformation, there is no alternative but for us to stand up together and tell the truth and the facts about the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and give the DDPA the possibility to play the role it deserves to play. I want finally to express my thanks to those civil society organizations who advocated for the decision to convene the Durban World Conference and who have supported all its follow-up under great difficulties. They ensured that the Durban Review Conference was provided with civil society backing in the same with the 2011 high-level meeting for the 10th anniversary. And I know that many of those are still with us and deserve our support in mobilizing for the 20th anniversary. It's very important that the real content of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action is known by everybody in all regions, and that we combat all this disinformation that has been produced. We know that there are lobbies that exist, especially in the developed world. And I think this is a disservice for humanity that is being performed. And it's very important that the Human Rights Council and that all countries who are together with us in the fight against racism, that we disseminate the real content and the real information about this milestone in the fight against racism that has been produced in the land of our dear Nelson Mandela. Thank you so much for your attention.
And thank you so much, Ms. Edna, Roland, for your contribution in your capacity really as the chair of the group of independent eminent experts on the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, sharing some insights that you gained also in the framework of that important work that you're doing. I think in the course of doing so, perhaps you spoke to one of the questions that Dr. Mcdougall raised, and that is, how do we galvanize political will into willingness? And you drew attention to the importance of civil society, of the people being more aware and being then sensitized and becoming those pressure points on our governments, and thereby also drawing out more political will among many others. So thank you for, I think, that very, very important perspective and emphasizing the need for human rights education. As a human rights educator myself, we take that important advice and imperative with us, and I'm sure many of our participants in the audience would also reflect on how each of us could contribute to that greater awareness of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Which brings us to the last of our four panelists. And it's wonderful also to see the bonds of solidarity between our four panelists. I think the struggle against racism is one that is won in solidarity, and those bonds are very noticeable. So we have Ms. Mona Rishmawi, who is at the moment the Chief of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination Branch in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. She was previously the Executive Director of the UN International Commission of Inquiry on Darfur, 2004-2005. And as I think many of us would know, this inquiry resulted in the first time that the UN Security Council referred a situation to the International Criminal Court, and I think many other ramifications that were attendant to that. She also served as the UN independent expert on the situation of human rights in Somalia up to 2000, and before that in various capacities within civil society. So thank you very much, Mona, for your presence here today. Ms. Rishmawi, we look forward to your contributions also to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, really. It's a huge pleasure to be with you today, and thanks a lot to the organizers for putting such a great panel together, panel of inspiring women leaders who have been at the forefront of the struggle for equality. whether on the basis of race and gender. I think that's really important. I haven't been in Durban. I was not there in 2001, but I've been very much involved in the last report that the High Commissioner just did on racial justice and equality. And I tell you, I felt very strongly that this struggle for racial justice and equality is really being held mostly by women, most of them of African descent, who are really holding this struggle. So it's wonderful to share the panel with them today. And it's, of course, a distinct pleasure to see our former High Commissioner, Navi Pillay, who is always a pleasure to be with, and to hear my dear friend, Gay Mcdougall. Congratulations, Gay, on your re-election to serve. And of course, Madam Edna, Roland Santosh, the member of the group of independent eminent experts on the DDPA, and to hear their perspective. In the last few years, as you said, I've been really leading the work within the Office of the High Commissioner on racial discrimination. The work on racial discrimination is very much in the branch that I actually work with colleagues, it's the team that I lead. And thanks to our High Commissioner Navi Pillay, this work has been really strengthened during her time, her mandate as High Commissioner. And I hope with the resolution adopted yesterday, I think we'll see more strengthening of this work, and I will talk about this. So my discussion today with you, or this afternoon, I will talk about the issues from an institutional structural perspective, and talk a bit about what I call the anti-racism architecture that was really created by DDPA, the Durban Conference and Outcome Document. And I will raise three main issues in this regard. So my first point that I will raise is that in the 20 years since its adoption, the DDPA, as it is known, and with its comprehensive coverage of issues, has proven to be a catalyst in laying the foundation for a global efforts in combating and preventing racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The second point that I hope to make is that since the adoption of the DDPA, because it's a catalyst, we have made progress. So significant gains have been made in combating and preventing racial discrimination, and particularly in the last decade. And the third point that I will make is that eliminating racism and racial discrimination has become an urgent priority, as we saw recently, and it was referred to a lot by the other speaker, by Pillay and by Kay and Edna, really, especially after what we saw after the killing of George Floyd and the protest, the Black Lives Matter protest that ensued in many parts of the world. So the DDPA have become even more important as a relevant framework in this regard. So let me start with the first point about the architecture. I think a lot has been said about the substantive, gains and the comprehensive approach to looking at racism and racial discrimination, particularly its root causes, and we mentioned that was mentioned before. Also about what makes the racism and aggravates racism, and the intersectional forms of racism, intersectional forms of discrimination, and how racism in particular, how it contributes to other forms of discrimination. And the nexus between race and gender here is particularly important. I would like, on this nexus, I would like just to make one point with regard, for example, to what the DDPA says on trafficking. The DDPA talks about, for instance, the issue of preventing, combating, and eliminating all forms of trafficking in persons. It looks at, it acknowledges that racism is often one of the main root causes of trafficking, and recognizes that victims of trafficking are especially susceptible to racism and intolerance. Globally, victims of trafficking are disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities. The DDPA provides considerable action-oriented instructions for member states on how to put the victims at the center. Major responsibilities entail, for example, implementing laws, protecting victims, ensuring available and appropriate legal redress for victims of trafficking, addressing root causes, as I mentioned, such as poverty, underdevelopment, and lack of equal opportunity, many of which are associated with discriminatory practices that render individuals especially vulnerable to be trafficked. The DDPA also has been far-sighted, and the example that I would like to give in this regard is the need to promote how the DDPA looked at communication technology, for example, including the internet. Don't forget this was adopted 20 years ago, yet we find language in the DDPA such as, excuse me, for example, expressing concern about the use of new information technologies for the purpose contrary to the respect of human values, equality, non-discrimination, and respect for others and tolerance, including programming and disseminating ideas of racial superiority, racial hatred, xenophobia, racial discrimination, and related intolerance. We just saw recently how, unfortunately, the social media have been used in the last, just in the last match, the last sport events that we all watch against players, athletes of African descent. And I think that connection between racism and sport and the use of social media, I think, it's very important to think that actually it was anticipated by the DDPA. I think Edna spoke a bit about the mechanisms created by the DDPA. And what I want to say here is that I think that was the biggest, perhaps, move forward. In addition to the declaratory statements about contemporary issues, the most important thing that happened with the DDPA is that it put measures in place for addressing these phenomena. So we have the Intergovernmental Working Group on Effective Implementation of Durban. We have also a working group on people of African descent and a group of eminent persons on people of African descent. These three mechanisms were added to already existing mechanisms, a special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and of course the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that our dear panelist, Mcdougall, is now a member. And this whole mechanism, these 5 mechanisms, create an impressive anti-EU and anti-racism architecture, which is continuously being strengthened. For example, the mandate to establish a permanent forum for people of African descent is now being discussed. And that's really important because that will provide for a mechanism where the voices of people of African descent can actually be heard within the United Nations. There is also a mandate to draft a declaration on the promotion and full respect of the human rights of people of African descent. And this is also extremely important. And yesterday, as we heard, the Human Rights Council adopted one additional mechanism, which I will come to it towards the end, which is really will move this architecture forward towards the protection of people of African descent. My second point, and I want to emphasize this point, is that the glass is half full. It is not empty, it is half full. So the DDPA has actually been effective in galvanizing support for work on racism or against racism and xenophobia. Concrete measures are being taken to improve human rights situation of racial and ethnic minorities in many countries. And our office have been working towards supporting the full and effective implementation of Durban. Over the past 20 years, the office provided technical assistance to governments for the adoption of anti-racial discrimination legislation and policies that comply with international human rights law. We also contributed to strengthening the capacities and specialized national and regional institutions to prevent and combat racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. We have also worked towards preventing racism and racial discrimination in the context of law enforcement, information and communication technologies, and so on. Just to give you some statistics of what we think happened, and these might not be, these are just data that we collected very fast. 42 states reported having adopted or amended legislation prohibiting racial discrimination. 35 states reported having established equality bodies for combating racial discrimination and promoting equality. 23 states and regional institutions reported having adopted national and regional policies against racism. 26 states have reported and have ratified the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which bringing this convention to one of the most ratified convention in the world. 182 states so far that are state parties. So there is progress that is taking place, and that we should not ignore. Two things that are happening very soon, and I want to bring this to your attention. Last year in December, the General Assembly adopted a resolution for an annual commemoration, an annual International Day for people of African descent. This will be celebrated or commemorated or marked on August 31st. And we currently, as I mentioned, we are working towards the establishment of a permanent forum. Member states are negotiating. We as an office of the High Commissioner, of course, our High Commissioner, like Madam Navi Pillay, who is actually the coordinator for the International Decade for the people of African descent, have been taking the lead on some of these issues, and really with the work, particularly of the working group on people of African descent, who've been extremely helpful in this work, have been visiting states, making recommendations, discussing thematic issues. Overall, more than 100 thematic discussions have taken place with concrete recommendations that were made in these areas about how states can move. One important program that we are particularly proud of is a fellowship program that brings people of African descent, young African descendants, to OHCHR for gaining knowledge and, if you want, training, but also bringing information to us about the reality of the situations that they live in. So far we have hosted 112 fellows from 35 countries, and these fellows have been extremely important when they go back to their communities. We've seen a lot of progress happening in communities. Some of them ended up being members of parliaments. Some of them ended up in ministers. Yesterday, when the discussion around the racism I think one of the most pointed interventions was one of the fellows that we had with us. So we continue to work on the promotional material and working on these things. But I have to say, I think that the most important thing is to show that Durban is making a difference in real people's lives. And that's what the office is committed to do. So despite these measures, and despite this progress, the half-full situation that I measured, we still face obstacles to overcoming racial discrimination and impunity. This was very clear in 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic generated a wave of stigma, discrimination, racism, xenophobia against certain national and ethnic groups. And despite national and ethnic groups being amongst the main health providers in many, and frontline actors in many countries, they faced systemic racism and they suffered inequality. So our office has been extremely at the forefront of highlighting this phenomenon. And our High Commissioner has intervened several times on these issues. We issued some guidance to states and other constituents on addressing racial discrimination in the context of COVID-19. And this became a theme that we raised throughout our discussions. This brings me to the third point that I wanted to mention, which is how important it is not to be satisfied with just adopting a document, but to work hard towards its implementation. And that brings me to the phenomena that I think touched a lot of us and touched me personally, I have to say, to the core, which is the movement, the equality movement, the racial justice movement that erupted in the world globally following the killing, the murder of George Floyd. And allow me here to open a brackets to remember and to recall Professor Christoph Heinz. Professor Christoph Heinz, his last work as member of the UN Human Rights Committee was to unpack the right to freedom of association and assembly, and to give us a gem, which what we call in our UN language, General Comment 37 of the Human Rights Committee, which basically looks at peaceful protest and how peaceful protest should end. And I kept using this document, and it guided us in our work following the death of the murder of George Floyd and the many others that happened in this context. So already was the report that we just did on racial justice and equality was just mentioned by Navi, by Gay, and also by Edna. And let me tell you, as someone who was very involved in this project, let me tell you a few things about what we actually did and what we actually learned. So immediately after the killing of George Floyd, the Human Rights Council, at the request of the African group, met in an urgent debate. It was an incredibly moving session. The brother of George Floyd spoke on that meeting, and a number of African leaders, including within the United Nations, our own Deputy Secretary General was also on the podium, and they all spoke about experiencing themselves racism, and the way Navi spoke today. And that gave us, and the result of that discussion gave us an incredible mandate. It gave us a mandate to look at systemic racism and violations of human rights by law enforcement. but it asked us to do something quite concrete. It asked us to look at how we can actually achieve accountability and redress for victims. So we embarked on a journey, and despite all our work on racism, on all our work, which we've done over many years, over decades of work, we felt very, very humbled by the movement. And we felt as an office that we cannot really embark on this work without listening to the people of African descent themselves. So we organized a number of consultations, 23 consultations. Some of them, Gay was in one of these consultations, or several actually. Gay, you were in a number of these consultations actually. And we listened to experts, to academics, to members of treaty bodies, to special rapporteurs. But most importantly, we listened extremely carefully to the people of African descent. And we posed questions, and it was very interactive. The dialogue was very dynamic. And I have to say, we felt extremely humbled by this experience. We felt that despite this, as I say, the wealth of recommendations that we have in the UN system, and by special rapporteurs and treaty bodies and everyone, the obstacles are very genuine. So we kept looking at what are the obstacles, and how we can overcome these obstacles. And this is how we formulated, or the High Commissioner formulated, the 4-point agenda for transformative change. What we wanted is really not to keep telling the same story year after year after year after year. We need to put a stop to this. We need to put a stop to systemic racism and to police brutality associated with it. And therefore, we said we need to transform the situation. And there are 4 key points that are incredibly important for transforming the situation. So we came up with these 4 points, which were at the center of what people of African descent, particularly the victims, told us. So the first point was about stopping the denial and start dismantling systemic racism by reversing denial and altering structures, institutions, and behaviors leading to directly or indirectly discrimination against Africans and people of African descent. The second point is really about accountability for law enforcement officials. This must be ensured, and violations and crimes must be tackled. And that means strengthening institutional oversight and very serious institutional reform. The third point that we made, and I think we were all very committed to this point, is that the voices of people of African descent, but not only them, those who stand up against racism, have to be heard, and the concerns must be acted on. We started from the point that the anti-racism work is really grounded in the UN Charter, in our foundation as the United Nations, and we have to take this very seriously. And the fourth point, and I think Navi, Gay, and also Edna mentioned this, is the importance to confront the legacies of the past and take special measures and deliver reparatory justice by recognizing that behind contemporary forms of racism, dehumanization and inclusion lies the failure to acknowledge responsibilities for enslavement, transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans, and colonialism, and to comprehensively repair these things. So yesterday, the High Commission presented this report on Monday, and really I think yesterday we got an incredibly, I have to say for me as someone who worked on this, an incredibly rewarding consensus resolution with a great and huge thank you to the African group, who I think managed the issues extremely well in the Human Rights Council. So we have an agreement, and the agreement has two recommendations in particular. So now there will be a setup, establishment of an international independent expert mechanism comprising of 3 experts that will look in particular at the systemic racism faced by African descent by law enforcement. So this one will focus on law enforcement and criminal justice system. Then the resolution also asks our office to enhance and broaden the monitoring of the situation of systemic racism through our field presences, and enhance our assistance to states and other stakeholders in order to continue to further action on this transformative agenda that I mentioned, and to really work towards the implementation of this transformative agenda. With this, I think we have now, with this, I think the architecture around anti-racism in the United Nations, we have a treaty body, we have a number of mechanisms, we have now a mechanism tailored towards law enforcement that actually fills an important gap in this regard, and the office there to support and work towards this transformation, you know, helps nudge this transformation that should take place. And I think all of this is taking place because we had a DDP, because 20 years ago, the world was alerted to the scourge of racism and the negative effect and the stigma, and how it really is affecting the daily life and the daily experience of people in real time today. And the experiences that we documented in the 190 cases that we gathered in the last over 190 cases that we gathered about the individuals who were killed by law enforcement just in the last 2-3 years was just a testimony. So I think we have a momentum, we can turn the page, and we have to take this momentum seriously. And I think we have an obligation as those, as people who work in the anti-racism agenda, to really not be defensive about this one, but really stand in solidarity with each other, bring in the equality movements together, bring in the people with us. And I feel after hearing so many people in so many countries over the last few months and how they talk about this, that the time is with us. We just need to push through, and we need to make sure that this is really concrete and we are achieving concrete results for real people in real time, in real places. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Mona, for your wonderful contribution. I appreciate you also noting our too early departed colleague, Christoph Heinz, his contribution. And as I think all of us know, he focused also in his work on impact of human rights norms at the domestic level. So I really appreciated your linking, your contribution today. You said Durban, you wanted to show, is making a difference in the real people's lives. And I think you showed that ably by looking at the office and what it has done since 2001, and how practices have been shifted, and also at the national level, how states at least have reported on all these numerous ways in which Durban has made a difference to how they are looking at issues and how this has actually impacted. So, and then drawing the line through to what I think Dr. Mcdougall called the George Floyd resolution, linking back what has been achieved so recently in that resolution to what started off in Durban. So thank you very, very much for that rich intervention. I think what we will do, and I'm quite a bad moderator because I've seen the time running, but I think the presentations were so rich that I just thought we will give our panelists the opportunity. What I suggest, and I think Dr. Mcdougall, if that would be fine, I'm going to go back in the same order and ask each of our panelists if there's a particular question. I'm going to raise the question with you and also ask you, since we have really come to the 2-hour mark already, we will then ask you also to summarize your takeaway message, any issue that you would like to share with us as a concluding thought. So we will start with Dr. Navi Pillay. And I think if I may go to the questions raised, Dr. Pillay, we have Patricia Sellers-Viseur on the particular question. Just a second there. Please comment on what could be termed the curious absence of slave trade as an international crime from the Rome Statute and from the statutes of the Yugoslavia, Rwanda special courts, and that for Sierra Leone. And the question then is, has the transnational crime of trafficking been used to erase to a certain extent the historical African origins of the international crime of the slave trade, even in the current egregious manifestations that we find in Syria? So Dr. Pillay, Navi, you may reflect you give your answers and reflections on that particular question, but also I think wrap up, I think one of the issues that have come through very clearly also in the comments is the concern people express about systematic, structural discrimination. What can be done? I think Mona pointed to a few steps, measures that had been identified. But in your concluding comments, you may also reflect on that. But you are free to look at the particular question that Patricia posed, but also then to give your concluding reflections, please, Navi, Dr. Pillay.
Thank you, Francis. A big hug to Patricia Sellers. You know, I often think the experts are not on the panel. They're out there listening to us, and they ask these difficult questions. So, Patricia, you know as well as I do, for retributive justice, where you seek the justice under the criminal law system, there are jurisdictional obstacles. So no court can go and try a crime that occurred years ago. Actually, it's an innovation with the ad hoc tribunals that the Security Council established the tribunal after the crime had occurred, but the justification is that those crimes already existed, such as genocide, acts of murder, and so on. So that's our difficulty in getting a criminal prosecution of historical crimes. I think we need a new mechanism for that. But, and I'm sure you've been following this with great interest, I like the way restitutive justice is proceeding. It was a success for the freedom fighters of Kenya when they secured a judgment from the British High Court that the Mau Mau be compensated, because they were always freedom fighters and not cutthroat killers as the media portrayed them. So there are some good examples of pursuing restitutive justice. I noticed in the DDPA and the subsequent documents and the General Assembly's focus on the 20th anniversary of Durban is to focus on reparation redress, which I think is a good road to follow rather than retributive justice. And of course, I was a judge on the Rwanda Tribunal and the ICC, but I was, as a human rights person, troubled by the amount of money that is being spent in a criminal court. The Rwandans always reminded us of that. They suffered the genocide and they received no compensation. So we need a holistic justice system. And I'd be very surprised how we could get slavery as a crime. Of course, apartheid is a crime in the Rome Statute, but there's no way they'd be able to prosecute the apartheid government. You see what I mean about past perpetrators. But if apartheid occurs anywhere in the world now, then the Rome Statute covers that. That is my answer. So Frans, did you also want me to give the concluding remark now?
Yes, I think that will just make it easy for us to go around once, because I see we are at the 2-hour mark, not to hurry us up, but to ask us to be concise to the extent
All right. So
possible.
as I said, the DPA is a very comprehensive document. It catches all. It's advanced now, as Mona pointed out, by identifying systemic racism, because these attitudes prevail all over the world. Not only law enforcement, Mona, I know that because of what inspired the Human Rights Council discussions was the George Floyd killing by police. And personally, I think had it not been for an outcry from civil society across the world, you wouldn't have had that first conviction of a police officer killing a Black person. Well, I lost track of what I was saying. Systemic racism has to be addressed, but as Gay pointed out, you will never manage to get the political will. Political will of governments will only come from pressure from civil society. So I'm very much in favor of governments work with civil society. You're not two parties. They should be part of government of the country as well. They have a voice. I'm very alarmed that more and more civil society has been excluded even from UN events. Those of my generation will remember that the NGOs were always packed in the basement of these halls. At Vienna, at Beijing, and the population conference, that you always had the NGO section. Well, more recently, the UN has excluded NGO participation in those halls. So there's a pushback against civil society participation. When I was High Commissioner, I identified that as a priority for our office, which is to assist and ensure greater civil society participation, to give them a voice. And that's a point I covered in my presentation here as well. And I'm sure that all NGOs will agree with me. They want their place back in there. They don't want to be outside the building. They want to be inside. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pillay, for your contributions and your participation today with us. We really appreciate it. Let us move to Dr. Mcdougall. You wanted to respond to an issue, Gay, but can I also raise a question from the observations by participants? Just the skepticism. We heard Mona looking at the achievement of the number of state parties achieved in terms of those that have ratified the CERD Convention. It's one of the most ratified treaties. But the question here is, does the UN really have the ability to make fundamental change in the area of racism when it cannot enforce, its treaties, the treaties that states ratify? So just maybe looking at that, let's say, it's skepticism around the role through treaties that the UN can effect change. As you conclude, and you also look at perhaps answering to this issue raised. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Mcdougall.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, whoever raised it. I first and foremost would consider myself an activist. That's what I usually say when people ask me what my profession has been. There have been some tools that I've used on the side, like international law, UN membership and all of that. But I have always felt that the force, the engine of change is with the people, if you will. And the one thing that has been clear to me at the UN with the work I've done through treaty bodies is that we are made effective when we are in collaboration with the civil society actors that come and tell us what the issues really are on the ground, that work with us so that we are able to articulate those issues and put them into the language of the treaty body, and then hand them back a document, a concluding observation, we would call the treaties, that they must then take to the next stage. We are, in a sense, intermediaries. And without that engine from civil society, yes, nothing happens. People say, hold my country accountable. Well, I say, no, it's the people of the country, the citizens, who have to hold their countries accountable. You tell me what I can say in UN language that will help you do that. But you are the main actor. And this is a follow-on from Navi Pillay's point about the essential role of civil society. And I would say in this George Floyd, over this last year, and we are very, very pleased with the work done by the Africa group. But what set that ball in motion was, of course, first and foremost, a terrible murder of this Black man on the streets, one of many, many. The next big actor was a 17-year-old girl that taped it, stood there throughout all that time and taped it, and therefore lit the sentiments of the world. But this matter would not have come to the Africa group, but for a coalition of civil society groups that decided, I played a small role in this, but decided that this thing has to be taken up by the UN. And George Floyd's brother, who said this must be taken to the UN. And so those of us who knew how to take it to the UN played that small role, but there were like 650 groups from around the world that signed a letter to the Human Rights Council that started the ball rolling. And then there was a phenomenal coalition, unprecedented coalition of groups from around the world. They band together to monitor this thing as it went through the process day by day over 1 year till it came out in this remarkable yesterday George Floyd resolution. So we, and all of this, I'm proud to say, most of this is essentially Black-led groups, and essentially groups led by Black women. And so these are the real engines of change. We at the international level, we have a role to play. Let's not forget it is a role that's handed to us actually from civil society. And so the engine moves through that pressure. And yes, Pillay, we must let civil society into the building. We must hear their voices in the chambers of the UN that's normally only accustomed to rarefied speeches about international relations and international law. But I hope and I fervently hope that we will all be able to see those doors to the UN open wider through a permanent forum on people of African descent that will create a real institutional role that will make sure that those doors are always open. Otherwise, you know, let's face it, we can commend each other, and we've all played important roles, but it's civil society that makes this. And let me just say, at the end of the day, a huge appreciation to the Black Lives Matter movement, which, you know, yes, which started by 3 Black women in the US, but was immediately, you know, picked up all around the world. So that's, I guess that's my final statement. I was proud to be a part of this unprecedented coalition of people who met nearly every day and even coordinated inputs into the informals of the decision-making about the wording of this final resolution. A tremendous leap forward institutionally, but until now unrecognized. But I hope that it will get its due as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mcdougall. That is really inspiring, and thank you for drawing these links, reminding us how you know, George Floyd's life and circumstances are linked back again to the resolution, to the future that we hope to see unfold. Our third panelist was Ms. Edna Roland Santosh. And I think, Edna, if I may pose to you one of the questions as you wrap up. I think the question was posed by Martha Schmidt. In addressing the disinformation campaigns against the DDPA, we need to identify who is benefiting and why, along with a strong narrative that does not reinforce the negativity of disinformation. And the question is, what are the best approaches for civil society to work across borders to promote the DDPA? So as you conclude concisely as you can, you may also want to address this question posed, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. And I also want to thank the person who has addressed this question. And it's really an important, interesting question. Who is gaining with the attacks that are being performed against the Durban Declaration and Program of Action? I think, I don't know if I have a clear answer for that, but we certainly know some of the countries, the governments and the groups who are refusing, for example, to participate of the commemorations of the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Countries that were in Durban who participated of the World Conference, so they were partners writing up the content of this historical milestone in the fight against racism. And 20 years later, these governments are refusing the document that they participated in producing. And so it's really something that we need to think why 20 years later they are criminalizing the document that they helped to elaborate. And I think that it's very important that everybody who is really in the fight against racism assume the importance and defend the Durban Declaration and Program of Action of a very important milestone that was written in African soil and in a very important moment, a very important turn point of our common history. And I would like, about this, I would like also to think that this question, if we can judge something that was committed in the past, slavery was committed in the past, although the consequences of slavery, the consequences of the colonial regime remain present until today. So I think, I'm not a lawyer, I do not come from this sector. However, I think that the consequence of this crime against humanity that happened in the past, and which results are so clear. If we think, for example, what is going on in the world at this moment, which are the countries who are having more difficulty to confront the pandemic of COVID-19. And if we analyze within our countries, which sections of the population, with groups of the population are having higher levels of mortality, and who are in more danger, who are unable to do homework, who don't have the technological conditions, who don't have the adequate access to housing, to water, and all the necessary conditions to protect ourselves against COVID-19, we will find very clearly in some regions of the world that these people are just descendants of those who were reduced to slavery in the past. Also, if you think in terms of international relations between countries, between regions, between continents, we will also find the prints of the experience that were lived during the colonial past. So slavery and colonial practices did not remain in the past. They continue nowadays. They have consequences nowadays. And so I think that it's possible to make this discussion and try to find a way of how we can overcome the results and the consequences of the colonial past and the slavery that our ancestors were reduced. And finally, to finalize, I would like to compliment the High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet for the report that came out these days. I think it's a very important tool for us to continue working against racism, against poverty, in all these conditions that are deepening the divide, continue to deepen the divide within our societies in the world that we live nowadays. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope that we will be able to meet each other in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those contributions again, Edna, and for your perspectives and your reflections, especially around civil society's role, and for answering the question posed. The last panelist then to whom we return is Ms. Mona Rishmawi. And I think if in addition to your concluding reflections, Mona, there are just two practical questions really raised in the chat box. Maybe we can just briefly for our participants. The one was, where do we get hold of this George Floyd resolution? And the second was, how does one apply for the wonderful fellowship that you mentioned? What are the requirements? So just very briefly for those who posed those questions, and then your concluding reflections on the issues that were raised here today. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. For the George Floyd resolution, I think it will be posted after the conclusion of the session, which is today. It will be, if you go to our website and look at the Human Rights Council 47th session, look at resolutions, you'll find it there. So I see someone actually did put hashtag there, but I think it will be subject to some editing, and then it will be posted as a final text on there, because there were we noticed there were some typos at one point. So they will be on the website. Again, go our website, Human Rights Council, 47th session, and then you go resolutions, and it will be there. It will be, I think it's called under item 9. You will find it. As for the fellowship, again, go to our website and please apply. We love to have. I saw your message. You are inspired by Mandela, but aren't we all? So please apply. We love to have young leaders. This is exactly the right profile of people that we'd like to see. It's a bit competitive. A lot of people apply for these fellowships. So put your best CV out there. Put your best and why you want to learn and all this stuff and what you'd like to do with it. And I hope you will have a very good chance. And if you want, drop me an email or drop one of my colleagues an email, and we'll help you. We'll find a way to at least get you the right documentation or put you on the right website. As for my concluding remarks, I just want to say just one point, which is that I think the last year, with the complexity of COVID and what we all went through, and as well as this amazing momentum and thirst for racial justice, I think it really, for me, it brought home the importance of solidarity. The importance of being in it together, and not only in words, but really accepting that we as human beings, we are threatened by virus. We are threatened by the virus as a virus that is attacking our health, but also as a virus of racism that is attacking our dignity and integrity. And I think unless we learn that we as human beings, we have to be able to stand up for each other, and not only for our own race or our own gender, but stand up for the dignity and integrity and the rights of everyone, I don't think we can achieve much. And if there is a lesson for this George Floyd experience and again the COVID experience, is that with solidarity, with standing up together, we can achieve results. And I think that's really important. And I would like, for me, that's really the point that I'd like to take forward. I'm a positive person in general. I like to take things positively. So I feel that it's the next stage will be better than where we started. And I think it is up to us to make it better. And I think we can make it better, and we should make it better. So thank you all, and thank you particularly the Center and the Pretoria Center for this fantastic panel. And thank you, High Commissioner Navi Pillay. You are there. All the colleagues are texting me. They are amazed to see you, and they love hearing your views. And of course, Gay, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon in Geneva, and of course Edna as well, and everyone here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mona. Thank you.
Thank you, HT. Thank you. I call you HT still, you see?
Thank you so much, Mona. Thank you for that optimistic end note. That is wonderful, I think, to fill us with that sense of optimism at the conclusion. So let me not, take any further time. I see in the chat the resolution number has been cited, so at least people will be able to locate it. I suppose there is no direct link to the final version yet, but that will soon be there. So without any further ado, let me ask Ambassador Mcdougall Nkosi, who is the South African Permanent Representative to the United Nations Office at Geneva, who's been quite instrumental also in making this event possible, working with the African ambassadors to give us his thoughts, his words in conclusion. Thank you so much, Ambassador, Your Excellency, for being with us this afternoon, this evening, this morning for some. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Viljoen, for this flattering introduction and for giving me accolades that I do not deserve. I will take them nevertheless. Let me thank you for giving me the floor, and at the same time salute you for the excellent moderation of the proceedings of this webinar. Your Excellency, Ambassador Ka of the Gambia and the current chairperson of the Africa Group in Geneva, distinguished panelists, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely honored to be accorded the privilege to make concluding remarks at what has, by all measures, been an extremely successful, indeed a resoundingly successful webinar, the second annual Mandela Human Rights Lecture under the theme 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, Achievements and Remaining Challenges. We have indeed come to the end of a very successful annual Nelson Mandela International Day, a day the UN has dedicated to the promotion of freedom, justice, and democracy. We celebrate the person of Nelson Mandela, his values and his dedication to the service of humanity, in conflict resolution, in race relations, in the promotion and protection of human rights, reconciliation, in gender equality, and in the rights of children and other vulnerable groups, as well as in the fight against poverty and the promotion of social justice, as well as his contribution to the struggle for democracy internationally and the promotion of a culture of peace throughout the world. On the eve of the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances, held in Durban 20 years ago, Nelson Mandela and Mary Robinson, the first UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, issued a pledge which challenged all delegations to adopt a declaration and plan of action which would ensure full recognition of the dignity and equality of all, and full respect for their human rights. A few years later, after Durban, the Human Rights Council was established pursuant to a decision of the UN General Assembly, making provision for the inclusion of an item on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance. Follow up to and implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. This in itself is a major achievement, which has ensured that this matter remains on the global agenda. We wish to sincerely acknowledge the dedicated contributions and efforts by member states over the past 20 years by spearheading various initiatives in terms of legislation and policies, and notably their national action plans against racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerances, as highlighted by our panelists today. It is only through a whole of government, and a whole of society approach that we can advance the anti-racism agenda. Among our remaining challenges is the need to ensure that in the execution and implementation of our national, regional, and global policy frameworks, we address deep-seated systemic and structural issues. We welcome High Commissioner Bachelet's agenda for transformative change towards racial justice and equality, which was presented at the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. This session, as has already been mentioned, adopted a groundbreaking resolution on systemic racism. This resolution was adopted unanimously. This follow-up resolution, successfully sponsored by the African Group in Geneva, calls for the establishment of an independent expert mechanism comprising of 3 experts with law enforcement and human rights expertise, with a 3-year mandate in order to further transformative agenda for racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement globally, especially where relating to the legacies of colonialism and transatlantic slave trade. It empowers the independent expert mechanism to investigate government's responses to peaceful anti-racism protests and all violations of international human rights law, and to contribute to accountability and redress for victims. The resolution is indeed a fitting tribute to victims of racism and will give renewed impetus to the struggle against racism in a year in which we mark the 20th anniversary of the DDPA and the 1st anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. The resolution represents a renewed era of global solidarity and cooperation to jointly address the scourge of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance through concerted international action and solidarity. As President Mandela once remarked, let us work together to create societies which recognize that all people are born equal, entitled in equal measure to life, liberty, prosperity, human rights, and good governance. Let us remain inspired by the memory of Nelson Mandela and respond to the call of the 2001 pledge to confront racism, dismantle its systemic and structural foundations, ensure justice, and provide healing to victims. I thank you.
And thank you very much, Ambassador Nkosi, for that also inspiring words and linking us back to Nelson Mandela and his own personal struggle, and that had been so much also informed by a struggle against racism and racial discrimination. It is up to me to very briefly just do a word of thanks, and I would like to start with our participants that had sacrificed, used some of their time. We know that there are many contending priorities in your lives, but we appreciate you making time and joining us for this, I think, very wonderful 2.5 hours. Secondly, I'd like to thank the co-organizers. I mentioned them at the beginning, the organizers of the Moot, and I would like to emphasize again the role of the African Group of Ambassadors in particularly bringing together this event. Let me remind you all that this is part of the broader Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot Court competition. Tomorrow, we have the semi-final rounds of that competition, and on Friday, the final rounds. The final rounds start at 11 in the morning, Central European time. And if you want more information, I'm sure you can just come to the website of the Center for Human Rights, which is there posted now also in the chat box. Thank you very much to our co-organizers. Then to everyone who shone as members of our panel and presenting in one form or another this afternoon, this evening. Thank you very much, Ambassador Carr. It was really wonderful to meet up with you again. Thank you, Ambassador Nkosi, for your contributions. But I think first and foremost, we have had 4 formidable voices, lives that had been shared, and perspectives from people who've been at the forefront in their personal and professional lives, the forefront against racism and racial discrimination. Here they are: Mcdougall, Edna, Roland, Santosh, Mona Rishmawi, and certainly last but not least, Dr. Navi Pillay. We really thank you. We were inspired. I think on the one hand, we've learned, we remembered that there are challenges, but there have been achievements. since 2001, since Durban, the Durban conference. But we are also inspired by what we've heard, the linkage between exciting things that are taking place now and seeing their roots in what had been achieved already in Durban. The struggle is not won, but it is ongoing. Let me then also lastly thank the silent workers, the ones behind the scenes, from the center side, from the organizer side, Yolanda Boyson, Teruna Naidu, who has been the technical assistants, and our own Eduardo Capapello, who is not only organizing the Moot, but also had been instrumental in this, and from the embassy side, Ivan Vosloo, who with others had assisted us in making this happen. I'm just at the final concluding moment, thinking back again that this is the second Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. Thank you for all of you for joining us, and I will do no better than citing one of our attendees in the chat box, that is Dr. Vicky Casanova Willis, and she concluded her remarks by saying, Baba Madiba would surely approve. With that thought, I think we should all move ahead in our own struggles. And once again, thank you so much for this, I think, very memorable second Nelson Mandela lecture. Good evening, goodbye, good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.